Okay, so my presentation is called Artificial Intelligence, Applied Artificial Intelligence, Teaching Information Technology Students How to Utilize Commercially Available Tools. So the scope of this presentation, it's really important for us to sort of zero in on the type of artificial intelligence or the application of artificial intelligence that we're looking at. Today, brilliant work is being done in AI by computer scientists, data scientists, statisticians, and AI researchers. Okay? That is great academic and professional work, but that is not what this course was about. Their work has resulted in several commercially available tools that IT professionals can include in their IT strategies for their companies. So I think it was important for us to be able to ensure that students who graduate with IT degrees at least are familiar with the categories of artificial intelligence tools that are commercially available so that they could include them in those strategies that are going to be supporting their organizations. So to that end, a course was built by me at Central Washington University for the Information Technology and Administrative Management program, and it taught IT students how to about available AI tools. So here were the outcomes of the course. At the end of the course, I wanted students to be able to describe the history of artificial intelligence and its evolution. I wanted them to be able to describe classes of common AI applications that are commercially available for use in IT. I wanted them to be able to evaluate the ways in which available AI tools can help organizations achieve their IT objectives. And I wanted them to evaluate past and current ethical considerations regarding the use of AI technologies. I selected 2 textbooks, and I have posted these slides to the site. So if you're interested in either one of these textbooks, you can grab them from this presentation. But the first one was Artificial Intelligence, 101 Things You Must Know Today About Our Future. And it really is broken to be 101 things. It's broken into chapters, but it just follows that kind of, in each chapter, there's maybe 10 things that you need to know. I think it did a really good job at giving a general look at the impact that AI has had on several domains. And those are like commercial domains, like the workplace or travel or other areas. And it provides good detail on the practical uses of AI, which is what this class was really about. The second text, Artificial Intelligence Basics, a non-technical introduction, was a pretty good book to give us more on the technology of AI. And so it introduced things like deep learning, machine learning, and other AI concepts, but did it in a way that was very accessible and very understandable and provided a lot of great context for the content that was coming out of the first textbook. We started the class with a history of AI, and anybody who's familiar with kind of the history of AI knows that it dates all the way back to the 1950s. And since that time, there have been great promises that have been made in the research and field of AI, but a lot of those were not recognized. So once, when they were initially proposed, they were well funded and people were excited about what the results were going to be. But because the results weren't that well recognized, there have been a lot of booms and busts in AI. There's been a lot of excitement that's been generated about what AI could do. But the reality is that when it didn't deliver on those promises, then we went into what was called AI winters, where the funding dried up and the research kind of waned a bit. There are groups of people who have different responses to AI. There are those who wholeheartedly embrace the advances made in the field. Those advances are being made by the large players like Google and Facebook and Microsoft and other big providers like that. There are those who don't think that the true promise of AI, which is thinking machines, is even possible. And those are the doubters. There are those who see the pursuit of AI as an existential threat to our current way of life. So those are the real big doubters. But while the researchers and the ethicists debate the future of AI, there is no doubt that the field has already had a significant impact on how many organizations will operate. Here was the outline of the course, and I'll go through these topics real quickly. It was a 10-module, 10-week course. We started out with the foundations and definitions of AI and examples of AI. Then we went through the history of AI and thinking machines and talked again about the concepts of AI winters when the funding dried up and the research kind of waned. We talked about industry impacts and big data. AI is necessarily married to data and data analytics because it's largely the processing of very large data sets that make AI possible. So we had to touch on the concept of big data. We talked about business and module 4 and business processes, machine learning, and concerns with AI. And I'll talk about the concerns with AI in a bit. Then in module 5, we had our first category of tools, which were chatbots. And then we also talked about the concept of deep learning. Then we moved on to workplace impacts and the tools that are focused on natural language processing. In Module 7, we talk about autonomous transportation, which is self-driving cars or self-driving vehicles. In Module 8, we talked about robotics and ethical considerations of robotics. In Module 9, I introduced the students to the 10 major players that are developing major movement in AI. And then in Module 10, they did a final culminating project. So a little bit about the concerns with AI. We took a quick look at ethical questions that are related to AI. And much of this is focused on the promises and not the practicality of AI. So a lot of people have been real concerned about, what happens if we actually do develop thinking machines? Well, that's, not really what we're dealing with today. Certainly the IT students that I was teaching we're not going to encounter that in anytime soon. So the questions really come about, should we do what the visionaries think AI should do or not? And that was really just, I wanted to make sure students were at least versed in those kinds of issues. More practical AI concerns include the use of human safety and job displacement. So we did talk a lot about that. Human safety has to do with things like interacting with robotics and autonomous transportation. And job displacement has to do with, what do we do with workers when we have nothing for them to do because a machine has taken over their job? So and that gets kind of back to those next 2 points. We also talked a little bit about where is the field going with machine learning and deep learning. And that's kind of the more research oriented focus of the AI field. The first category of tools that we looked at were chatbots. So chatbots provide good information and services to organizations' customers, and it requires a good deal of front-end work to do properly. Chatbots are only as good as the effort that was put into them when they were initiated. If we don't put enough knowledge and information into a chatbot, it doesn't have the ability to return good answers and good useful information to the users. So it's really important that that be done carefully and properly. But chatbots are really everywhere. They're becoming the opportunity for us to be able to allow organizations to provide service to customers 7/24/365, and they can reduce costs substantially. So it's likely they will be an important part of a suite of IT tools for many organizations as we can expand service and lower our costs. The next category of tools we looked at were natural language processing tools. And this is really, something that we've all encountered in the last 10 years, as we've seen Siri and Alexa in our phones and the various other tools that use natural language processing. It becomes an interface between technology and users, and that's really kind of its sort of strongest point. It's also being used to capture and generate large volumes of text when it's needed. Could be something that is very useful for a chatbot. There still remain many challenges with natural language processing, simply because there's so many not overt meanings of text and of language that natural language processing isn't able to discern. I already indicated that there are popular applications such as Siri and Alexa and other similar applications. But again, the ability for natural language processing to work also depends on there being relevant content that is available. How many times have we talked to an Alexa and she tells us basically that she doesn't know what we're talking about? So that's just something that's going to have to expand in that field. And it can be useful, but natural language processing can wind up being useful for a useful part of an application for IT for a number of companies. We spent a good deal of time in the course talking about autonomous transportation, and it's largely when we think about autonomous transportation, we think about self-driving cars, but there's so much more to autonomous transportation than self-driving cars. There are a number of different modes of transport that are actually something that could be run by a machine. But one of the biggest things that would impact companies and organizations around the world will be logistics and supply chain technologies. How do we get supplies from one part of the supply chain to another? And is there a way that we could, because right now it's very expensive and it's very time consuming, and is there a way that we can use autonomous transportation to sort of lower that cost and lower that time? Vendors need to be concerned about how they're shipping products to consumers' homes, and that's going to be probably something that looks at autonomous transportation in the future, simply because there's so much more demand for that now, especially since the pandemic. So autonomous transportation, getting products to customers, could wind up being a very large part of a future IT solution. We also have to concern ourselves with the safety issues, which I mentioned earlier, safety issues having to do with how safe are these autonomous transportation technologies. We spent a little time talking about robotics, but not robotics in the traditional sense that we see in the popular media. We did not talk about sentient machines because those really don't exist. Instead, we talked about robots that are really workhorses that are good at repeating program tasks, doing it very quickly, doing it very efficiently. So probably future IT graduates are more likely going to deal with those workhorses, and they need a clear understanding of their applications and their return. The use of robotics can be very efficient, but it's very expensive to implement and maintain. So there has to be a clear return on that investment. But it could be a great area of expansion in IT and also artificial intelligence. Once we went through all of those topics and all of those different categories of tools, the students were given a project. And the project they were given was a case study. They were to develop a 5-year IT strategy for a scenario. It was a fictitious company. The IT strategy must enable organizational strategy. So whatever IT tools were proposed had to support the way the organization wanted to operate. And students were tasked with including AI tools, which they could go out and independently research and integrate that as part of the IT strategy. They didn't have to write a paper. What I had them do instead was put together a presentation with sufficient notes that they could present to organizational leaders, stating that this was what our proposed IT strategy was going to be. And they needed to describe how the inclusion of commercially available AI solutions into the IT strategy was going to help the organization meet its goals. And lastly, just a little bit about the course. So far, the course has only been run once. It was positive to see the activity level of the course was very high. Students were very engaged in the interactions, very engaged in the discussions, and put a lot of effort into it. Their final projects clearly demonstrated that the material was well received. And the outcomes, I believe the course outcomes were met. This is a course, however, that is going to have to continuously be revised and revamped as new tools become available and new evolutions happen in the field. So, okay. So that is my quick presentation of my paper. Feel free to read my paper if you want. Are there any questions?